Everybody, to another episode of Teacher Prep Tech with Dr. D. I'm Dr. D, and tonight I'm joined with my colleague here, Ross, who has just written a new book. Ross, tell us about your book and why we should consider project-based learning
Yeah.
for classroom instruction.
Yeah. So the first project-based learning book that I co-wrote was with Aaron Murphy. Actually, they were both with Aaron Murphy, who's a colleague of mine, former co-worker, but now just a colleague, which is fine too. We wrote our first book together, Hacking Project-Based Learning, I want to say 3 or 4 years ago. And then after that, about 3.5 years straight, did a lot of consulting on PBL, did a lot of presenting, really fully immersed in that type of work. And then we're like, we have more to say. So of course, when you're that involved in that type of work, you tend to refine your practices, refine your thinking a little bit. You have more to say. So we wrote what is probably our last book together, or our last book period on project-based learning. Project-based learning, real questions, real answers, how to unpack PBL and inquiry. I definitely recommend the new book more with the blue cover more so than the old book, Hacking Project-Based Learning. Very, very, very proud of it. Each chapter in the book is our response to a common question that educators have about project-based learning. And all of our, go ahead.
I work with new
Yeah,
teachers. My
yeah,
audience here is new teachers. What is project-based learning? Because I feel like it can be a very gray area, especially if we're trying to distinguish between project-based and problem-based. So let's break it down from what is project-based learning, and maybe
yeah,
what would it look like in a content-specific area?
yeah. So that's like always a great question, and that's a common question, and one that, believe it or not, isn't the easiest to answer. The way I define it is, if you look at inquiry-based learning. So we'll start with kind of comparing and contrasting inquiry-based learning with project-based learning. Inquiry-based learning, I define it as students learning through investigation or some type of exploration, right? This idea of student-centered learning, where they're learning through investigation and exploration. That could be applied to anything. It could be applied to a lesson, it could be applied to an activity, um, anything that's done, any moment of learning in the class in the in the class or in your learning space, for the most part, could be done through some type of inquiry. In my mind, when you then have inquiry span across an entire instructional unit, right? So if you think about lesson plans and you think about unit plans, when you have inquiry, students learning through investigation, expand across an entire unit, in my mind, that's the core of project based. Could you start to say that there have to be certain components? Sure. You could say that they have to be tackling an authentic problem, um, possibly creating something. They have to be engaged in inquiry. They have to be engaged in reflection. They have to be engaged in collaboration. They have to be engaged in publishing. Sure, all those components, you could say, help to define PBL. And I do think it's okay for one organization's definition to be a little bit different than another's, as long as we own it, right? And make it our own. For the sake of ownership, I think that's okay. But at its core, it's an inquiry based unit. Um, as far as a specific example, the example that I give, I'll say in the first book, is something that near and dear to my heart, is our Pinball Wizard project, where my fourth graders um, learned about electricity and magnetism and force and motion while engineering pinball machines. So a lot of times people also ask, what is the difference between a project and project-based learning, right? A project, you almost look at it as the dessert. Like, now that you've all done all this learning, you're going to do something cool with the learning, right?
Right.
And to be blunt, it's kind of like what's the point? We've already learned everything. We've shown that we know this, or maybe we don't know it. So maybe we need to be retested or retaught, which is fine. But once the unit is done, I guess, in short, what's the point of then doing something else with the content when you've already done what you needed to do? Whereas with project-based learning, rather than saying, now that we've learned this, let's do something with it, it's saying, okay, over the next 4, 6, 8 weeks, we're going to do something really great, like learning pinball machines. In order to be successful with those machines, we're going to learn about electricity, magnetism. We're going to learn about force and motion. We're going to learn about Newton's laws of motion. We're going to learn about flippers, bumpers, and electrical circuits and things like that. So it's that context is really important, and that push and pull between the parts and the whole. So all those individual lessons, which are the parts, take place within the context of the whole, which is the pinball machine.
Right. So
And
they're
therefore,
learning while
yep,
doing.
yeah, learning while doing and attaching those individual lessons, whether they're mini lessons or extended lessons or experiments, to a bigger whole, which is either maybe a product that's going to be created or some type of event that's going to be planned for, or potentially a problem that's going to be tackled. Yeah.
I mean, that in many ways it becomes the hook, right? It's like the why for student engagement because they're learning what they need in terms of the information to actually tackle the project or the problem that they're working on.
Yeah. It's almost like I love the term productive struggle. It's that productive
Mm,
struggle as they go back and forth, like I said, between the parts and the whole. So thinking about electrical circuits in isolation is okay, and that's done in a lot of maybe science textbooks. So you could still use those same experiments from a textbook potentially, but as you're grappling with how to attach it to the whole, which is the pinball machine, that's really a lot of times where that productive struggle takes place. Just like research, if we do research in isolation, like if you go to the librarian for 40 minutes a week and do research in isolation, that's great, right? But there's no context. In a way,
right.
it's an authentic activity. But if you're doing it within the context of some type of an authentic research project, then that work has something to latch onto. It's much more relevant. It's much more engaging. And like I said, there's this productive struggle as we're attaching that what would previously have been isolated research. We're attaching that research to the greater whole, which is the project in and of itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've definitely been guilty of doing like a project, for
Yeah.
example, adding and subtracting decimals. I have my kiddos make a menu and we do menu math. And
Hmm.
then they go around and they take orders from,
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
they pretend to be waitresses and which is really fun. But as you
Mhm.
shared, Ross, the learning about adding and subtracting decimals has
Mhm.
already happened. It's
Yeah.
already
Yeah.
happened. So
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
becomes a product of what they've already mastered rather
Yeah.
than achieving mastery through the project.
Yeah. 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 I think looking at things through like a bit of a leadership lens, um, those things are okay, right? We've all been there, and anybody who's proficient with project-based learning got their foot in the door somehow, and that was most likely through a more traditional project. So I always like to say like it's
Mhm.
okay to be where you are, but it's not okay to stay there. So it's fine. It's fine. Like so as leaders or anybody as educators, it's fine like that you did that. Okay, now let's talk about how we can move forward. But I think it's important not to take this elitist attitude. Be like that's not project based learning. What are you doing? Because we've all been there, right? We've all been there. And if somebody took that attitude with us, it most likely would have been discouraging, and we wouldn't be where we are now, right? So it's this idea that everybody's learning is in a different place.
I love it. So tell us what got you interested in project-based learning and
Hmm.
why did you feel like you needed to write a book about it?
Yeah, yeah. So more or less, I think whether we do it consciously or subconsciously, we tend to teach the way that we wanted to have been taught when we were in school, right? So this is how I would have wanted to have learned. If I think about what I remember, think about what you remember from school, right? Nobody ever said that worksheet changed my life. So I think I remember the projects and the PBL experiences. When I became a teacher, I think a lot of times we become we enter the profession with these ideas of like changing the world and being the best teacher ever. And then what happens is I think to a lot of teachers, and this is going to sound bad, so I'll apologize in advance. So like sorry, not sorry, but like I think we conform. Like so, for instance, like I was on a third grade team when I started. And it wasn't the easiest thing because it's basically like I was right out of grad school. I think I was like 24 or 25. I'm on a third grade team. And, a lot of times you hear, uh, that's not the way we do things here, or that's not how our team functions. And then I think what a lot of times, whether it's that or the union mentality sometimes, not that I'm anti-union or anything like that, I'm just saying the union mentality sometimes,
Right.
we tend to gravitate almost like towards the middle, like they call it like the widget effect. Um, rather than like really innovating and standing out. So that was something I grappled with a little bit when I became a third grade teacher and then a fourth grade teacher. And originally I was a long-term sub. I wasn't contracted. And my the first big influence in my professional career, Dr. Anthony Moyer, pulled me aside when he gave me a contract, and he says, "Ross, I'm going to give you a contract. You're going to teach fourth grade, and mostly because I respect the fact that you center your students, regardless of what people think about you." You know, and I'll always remember that conversation. Um, so I did a little bit of conforming, probably a little bit too much. And there was one particular year, long story short, where I had one of those classes where the students struggled. You know, you
Mhm.
could say almost like the low students. And I hate it when we refer to students as low. You know, I say that with intentionality, like, you know, labeling students as low, like not a good thing, you know. But they were like that class where the students struggled. And it was after state testing that year. I think it was like March or April. Um, the entire year, for the most part, I was kind of banging my head against the wall, teaching in a more direct instruction type way, trying to get my
Right.
students to regurgitate content. And then after state testing, I was kind of like, the heck with it. Let's have them do a PBL experience. Now, looking back on it, it was a project, but it was me getting my foot in the door with PBL. And they basically researched artists. They researched artists and they created PowerPoints. And I remember bragging about anybody who would listen that my third graders were doing PowerPoints, you know, and this was probably back in what, like 2009, maybe 2009,
Mhm.
2008. But I just remember, although it wasn't the greatest, the most perfectly executed project, in fact, it was way off thinking back on it. Um, I remember my jaw hit the floor with what my students were able to accomplish when I put them at the center of the learning, as
Right.
opposed to me constantly hammering them over the head with direct instruction. But I think not entirely, but in general, can be one of those big, like, kind of like misconceptions in education that if students struggle, they need direct instruction. Sure, but they need other things too, right? So, bottom line is my jaw hit the floor. My students did a great job, and I said to myself, going forward, I'm going to start every school year with these types of experience and make sure
Mhm.
that they're rolled out almost continually throughout the year. And
Right.
that's what I did. And then slowly but surely, I educated myself. I attended professional learning. And what I did over the course of a couple of years transformed from projects into PBL experiences. So to me, that was like a big turning point, um, as well as the support that I got from my principal, like I said, Dr. Anthony Moyer, and also some of the support I got from my district as well.
So you talked about the process of like moving from projects to PBL.
Hmm.
Talk to us about like what is kind of the teacher moves in terms of actually planning a project-based learning activity for their students.
Oh wow, so that's loaded, right? So I think yeah. So it's not, nothing's ever entirely linear, right? And just when you think it's linear, it's not. Um, I could so I look at it as like there's like different starting points that you could have. One of them could just be, let me actually, I have the book open right here, the latest book.
Hey, let's see.
Rather than me like trying to like memorize this, and like I said, I wish I had a copy of the book right in front of me, but I don't, or a physical copy, but I do have. So I consider there to be five starting points, and like I said, just to make sure I don't goof this up, I'll just scroll to that in the book, which is in the first chapter, the first right after the introduction, the first chapter, which is how do I structure a PBL experience. So students, right, find out what's relevant to them. Give your students voice, right? A lot of times we overplan in isolation and we try to guess what works for our students rather than giving them voice and choice. So
I see.
engagement versus relevance. Engagement a lot of times is short-lived. It's about us. Relevance is about them, right? Which might, of course, vary from student to student, group to group, class to class. You could start with a cool idea. That's fine, right?
Mhm.
That's fine too. We have those cool ideas, as long as they connect to the academic standards, if we're being held accountable for the standards in this instance. A process, if you're talking about like design thinking or the engineering process, you could build a PBL experience around that. The end in mind, which is if you think about like backwards design, understanding by design, what do you want? We call them high impact takeaways, but you could also like enduring understandings. What do you want
Sure.
your students to know, understand, and be able to do as a result of the learning experience. You could start with that, or you could start by flipping through your academic standards, which doesn't really sound fancy or fun, but believe it or not, flipping through them and looking for those like priority standards or power standards that call for a deeper understanding of content, um, that helps as well, because those standards that are priority standards and that call for a deeper understanding of content could easily serve as the basis for a PBL experience. So those are 5 good starting points. Um, and assessment is a big part of this, right? So once you've established what you really want your students to take away from the project, it's how are you going to assess that? And
Mm-hmm.
what are the academic standards? And then learning targets, which are student-friendly standards that are going to serve as the basis of the project's assessment and also as the basis of the project's instruction. So I think, once again, like having those firm starting points in mind, a lot of times you'll hear somebody say, this is where you need to begin. I think there's multiple entry points, right? There's no one right way to do things. But then also thinking about those learning targets, which are your student-friendly standards, which are the core of your assessment and also your instruction. And I've always said you get once you get the assessment part right when it comes to PBL, or not just that, but like teaching in general, the rest kind of just flows. Like if I'm doing a PBL workshop and someone raises their hand and says, "What about assessment? What about grading?" It's like that could be like 3 days, right? Right? It's
Right.
loaded. It's loaded, but
I mean,
it's
assessment
definitely
is
worth
like
tackling. Yeah.
continuous, right? It's happening like the moment you interact with the student and you ask a question to what they're producing or what they're creating, or the kinds of questions they have is always giving me insight into like what my students know and what misconceptions they have. And of course, I come from a math background, so
Hmm.
it's very like clear in terms of the types of content or the types of thinking I want them to have. Like we're tackling surface area. So I want them to be able to calculate surface area, and I want them to know what a net is, and I want them to be able to distinguish different types of geometrical shapes. And so it's very clear, but I think it gets really muddied when you're in more subjective content areas. So how would you do PBL in like a history or a social studies class? Or an English class or a health class? Like
Hmm.
what would that look like? What are some examples that you've come across?
Yeah. So I think it actually follows. It follows like the same. I don't want to say formula, because then when you say formula, it has to, um, you're led to believe that you have to follow like certain steps. But I guess the same process. It's a very similar process in my mind, regardless of subject area. So to bridge the gap, to talk about math, to talk about like consumer science, like one of the things I had my students do, and that I've seen done many times, is like students building, engineering their own health shakes, right? So
Mhm.
that ties into math with measurement, and that also might tie into like nutrition and health and things like that, which I personally need to get better at. But who doesn't love a good health shake? So, and that's the difference between like, now that you've learned all these things about nutrition, now that you've learned all these things about math and fractions and measurement, now we're going to do a health shake. Instead of saying, "Hey kids, for this unit, we're going to do health shakes." And I know you're nervous. I know you don't know everything that you need to learn in order to make this happen, but I'm going to teach you along the way, right? So
Right.
that to me, like in a nutshell, that's the difference between projects and PBL. Um, but yeah, and I think the important thing there is, one, the academic standards, which I mentioned, but two, however you craft your directions and however you craft your assessments, that's really going to guide students to where you want them to be. So if I say to something like, you're going to create so just a simple example, like you're going to create um, a recipe for your health shake,
Mhm.
and everything has to be written in fractions, rounded to the nearest like tenth or something like that, right?
Right.
Then students are going to then be forced, right, to bump into displaying that type of knowledge. If then I then say, not only do they have to be done in fractions, but now they also have to be done in decimals, right? All your
Right.
measurements also have to be done in decimals or cups or ounces or whatever. Like, so you're formulating your assessments and you're formulating your directions in a way that forces students to bump into, or gives them opportunities to demonstrate um, the knowledge of the academic standards that you want to hit with your particular project. I think the key is to do it in a way that isn't entirely inauthentic, right?
Mhm.
So when students see the directions, um, like you want it to make sense. You want it to, maybe if it's not a completely authentic task, you at least want it to like appear to be authentic and not like you're trying to cram a square peg into a round hole.
So you're saying let's give them some type of criteria that they can then use to frame the choices they make about the product they're creating. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yeah, it's like a push and a pull. It's like, what are you going to tell them they need? It's basically saying like, you could do whatever the heck you want as long as you show me that you know this, right?
Right.
And that's really what it is, the push and the pull. So how much are you going to leave up to them?
So tell us about
But
how you incorporate technology in this process, or is that kind of an aside?
yeah, so I think with technology, hi, is it your daughter? What?
Yeah, that's my mini me.
Hey, mini me. She misses you. Um, so the technology I think for every project is there's always some type of what I've always advocated for, and this is in the book as well, some type of digital hub. So
Right.
the question, especially with distance learning, remote learning, whatever you want to call this craziness that we've been enduring for the past couple of years and still enduring in some instances, is how might students continue with their projects when they're not in my absence? And the first thing I say is create a digital hub um, with all of your project's content. And I even did that when I was in school, you know, when I taught fourth grade. So, for instance, if students like lost their directions or something like that, they didn't have to
Right.
say, Mr. Cooper, I lost my directions. Where are they? And then what I would say is try to format your digital hub in a certain way. So, although the content might change from project to project, the way the hub is organized does not. So, I'm looking once again in the book real quick if I could find it. So, you might have one section where you have things that are project specific. Such as directions, um, the your assessment tool, whether it's a rubric or something else, a glossary of terms, you know, those overarching materials that are project specific.
I mean,
Then,
you could
go
use
ahead.
something like Google Classroom, and have a Google Drive folder with all the materials for your particular project.
Yeah,
I
that. So,
Yeah, one time I had my students create a Google website because we were talking about proportions, and they had to create a business,
mhm,
and they had to create a items and a cost for each item,
yeah,
and then they
yeah,
would create a bundle price.
mhm,
And it was just like they did an entire like business portfolio on Google Sites,
mhm,
which I then was able to go in and look and view. And of course, because we were in Google Classroom, it was all behind the school firewall. So there wasn't an issue of it getting out into the world. But they got to see their products of learning, which was pretty exciting.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
So I'm thinking something like that, or are you using something like Symbaloo where they're hyperlinking to different sites or
Okay. Yeah. So what you're talking about is basically like the product, like what they're creating, right? As
right,
a result of engaging in the PBL experience. For now, I'm just talking about like where are you posting the materials for the project, right? Or the
sure.
content for the project, right? So there's a difference. I think and either or, right? It could always end up being the same thing. It could be it could be as simple as even like a Google Doc with a bunch of links,
Mhm.
right? And if you're going to link to something like a document or something, upload it to Google and link to it from that document. I call it like a landing page, right? So you could just basically have a nicely crafted um, Google Doc or landing page with like headers, and under each header there's the links that students need, um, or like a couple blocks in Google Classroom or whatever it might be. Symbaloo would work too. I think consistency is important. So,
Mhm.
like I said, when a new project is rolled out, it's not like, oh my gosh, look at these materials are all over the place. There's some familiarity, and like I said, the only thing that really changes is the
So
content
it's
and
structure.
yeah, the structure is consistent. Yeah,
So let me ask you, when you're creating a project-based learning activity, because I think teachers kind of don't they need to know like the whole scope of how long does it take
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah.
actually create this type of activity. And you talked about the standards and the technology, like what does that look like in terms of putting all these pieces in place so that when you roll into the classroom, you can have success with the project that you've created?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's no other way about it. It's definitely more upfront, right? It's more
Mhm.
upfront. It might take you a good weekend. Um, and but then the day to day, rather than going to school every day saying, what am I going to teach and how am I going to teach it? Everything that's being taught is done within the context of the PBL experience. So you're spending more time walking around the classroom, meeting with students one-on-one, meeting with students in small groups, maybe pulling the entire class if you see that the majority of them are having trouble with a particular concept. Um, Responsive teaching, right? So by doing some of that planning ahead of time, you have better and more opportunities to respond to the needs of students and meet them where they are rather than the other way around, which is really powerful. But like, you could bang out the planning for a good project over a weekend if you work hard at it, right? It could be done. The one thing I caution against is like over planning and isolation. This idea that I'm going to, labor away over a long weekend. I'm going to plan the perfect project and then I'm just going to deliver it to my students, right? And when we overplan in isolation, we're leaving out our most valuable stakeholders, who are our students. So as
Mm.
we go through the planning process, and especially when students become familiar with project-based learning, basically asking ourselves, uh, how might we transform our students into co-designers rather than
I
just
see.
recipients of what we've created? So that is always something to think about. It's a push and a pull. Maybe the first couple, like, so if you're teaching like fifth grade or something like that, maybe, and your students really aren't accustomed to PBL, maybe the first one or two, you kind of more do it to them in a way,
Sure.
while laying the groundwork with by creating the culture and getting them prepared for it, and then you could turn more and more of the ownership over to them through something maybe like gradual release. But over planning and isolation, I think, is a huge, just this idea that like, we're so proud of our projects and they're all shiny and perfect, and then we're just going to
Yeah.
deliver it to our students. We've all been there, right? And then,
I
but
get
it's,
so
yeah,
married to that space, and
yeah.
then, and then I put it on Teacher Pay Teacher and say, "Who wants to buy it?"
Exactly. And it's like you're selling, and I'm, like, we've all been there, but it's like whoever created this has never met me, has never met my students, has never been in my space. And each
Right.
type of project is going to land differently with each group of students. So I don't think there's anything wrong with um, downloading a pre-made project. Sometimes like it kills me, like when you do like a multiple day workshop, or even like you do some professional development on PBL and somebody raises their hand and they're like, and you're like, yes, and you know what's coming, and they're like, where could we find projects? You know what I mean? It's like the beauty of this is creating something on your own. I don't think there's anything, I guess there's nothing wrong with that. I think as long as we have a process to kind of critically reflect upon what we're downloading, or what we're getting, just like we want to be a critical consumer, just like we would with the
Sure.
textbook, right? So just like we're a critical consumer with the textbook, we don't want to regurgitate the textbook and give it to our students. How might we think critically about projects or PBL experiences we download from the internet in order to make them work for our students and us, right?
I see. So put like your own, like the own culture and context of your kiddos into that space.
Yeah, so I'll say, like, in the book, in the last chapter, how do we get started, I mean, there's so many different ways you could critique a project, but the 6 questions we ask is: when does the learning occur? What relevance does the project have on students' lives? Science, who assesses the learning? To what extent can the project be personalized? And anything else you'd like to add. So those are like
Mhm.
6 questions that we've used even in workshops, looking at a pre-made project, looking at it through the lens of those questions, and how might you then refine it in order to make it work for your students and you. Yeah.
Awesome. So we have a question from Gail. She said, my old school had 6-week projects, and then the students would switch teachers for science example. That way they only had to create about 3 a year. This
Yeah.
was 4th and 5th grade classes.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think about 6-week projects? That seems kind of labor intensive, but you're the PBL expert, so I don't want to put my bias in there, but I'm like, dang, 6 weeks.
Yeah, when people, it's like funny because everybody always wants a length, right? How many standards do you incorporate?
Right.
How long should it be? Um, and I think in general, I always say start off small, right? Start off small. Um, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with 6 weeks. I did 6 week projects, but if you think if you're especially if you're not used to teaching in a PBL type way, and you plan a project and you think it's going to go 4 weeks, it's going to go like 6 or 8 weeks, right? So I remember like when I first started doing this, it was like first the students are going to do this, and then they're going to do this, and then they're going to do this. Like all these things that sounded great and looked great on paper. And then instead of this, and this, it should have just been like this, like one thing in depth. That's it. Because then what happens is, I think this has probably happened to everybody. It definitely happened to me several times. It was like you just want the project to be over, right? You're like limping
Right.
towards the finish line, and you don't have the heart to pull a plug. Um, so I always say start small because it's always going to go longer than you think it is. Um, but Gail, yeah, I think 6 weeks is fine. Like I said, I personally wouldn't aim for 6 weeks if I was just starting out. Um, and um,
Oh,
yeah,
she's
yeah,
the
there
only
you go.
one.
She's filtering in different. Yeah, they only had.
Well, then you have the flip side,
Yeah,
Ross,
yeah,
because I've
yeah,
definitely worked with kiddos that were
yeah,
so amped to do the project that they
yeah,
went home and they continue to work on the project
yeah,
or
yeah.
finished in
They
a
only had.
week.
Yeah, was that they only had med? They only had me one day a week. They only had me
Yeah,
one day a week. Yeah, yeah. So there's different variables. The only thing I strongly feel is that when you're starting out, start small. That's it. Like that's it. But
right.
I did projects that were as long as 8 or 10 weeks. I did. And like thinking about it, you could have projects that last an entire year. Like if you have something like, like a farm to table, like outdoor, garden, and you're having students run the cafeteria, that technically is
Sure.
PBL and it might last the entire year. Um, I think putting a number on it, people like numbers as guidelines, but I always say it's just that, a guideline. Um, because there's so many variations and everybody's context is definitely different. I think what's great about what Gail's talking about is it looks like the teachers, her and the teachers that she's working with, found the way to make this like systemic. And a lot of times we
Mhm.
do that. It's like you learn in a quote unquote like more traditional way. Then if you go to this teacher, or for this month of the year, we're going to do PBL. And I think if you could tackle inquiry and maybe PBL in a systemic way, it's powerful. It's not easy, um, but I think it could be powerful.
So you mentioned the whole idea of like integrating content across the curriculum. Like you were talking
Yeah.
about the pinball example and you talked about STEM and math and things like that.
Yeah.
So what about if you're working at a secondary school? Like what
Hmm.
advice would you give? Because it sounds like you are recommending to integrate content across the curriculum. What advice would you give for
Yeah.
those single subject content area specialists to
Yeah.
really harness the power of PBL?
So I think you could start with a single subject, right? If you're not really used to this and you're not really used to PBL, and say, not only are we going to jump into PBL for the first time, but we're going to make it interdisciplinary, I think that could be tough, right? You might
Mhm.
be biting off more than you could chew. So, advice for those starting off, maybe just tackle it within your own subject area, your area of comfort first, and then think about what it's going to look like across maybe two subject areas and then maybe three. I think the biggest mistake that I see is is tackling it across multiple subject areas, but doing it from the lens of a topic, like a shared topic. So like, um, I'll just dumb this down for the elementary level because the elementary level is cute. It's like in writing workshop, they're going to write about leaves. In art class, they're going to draw and paint leaves. In music class, they're going to sing about leaves. And I'm saying this because it's the fall and it's October and it was just Halloween. Like,
Sure.
or you could use like the what's used in some, like I've seen used in Understanding by Design. The book is like apples, leaves, apples. You could use anything, right? You could use anything as an example. And basically, it's topic based, right? So although it might be cute, although students might be covering, I guess, the same topic across multiple subject areas, it doesn't necessarily lead to a deeper understanding of
Sure.
content. So although I think a topic is fine, when I talked about those academic standards, think about like the assessment piece and the standards. I would intentionally pull standards from multiple subject areas, and not just any standards, but if you could find those high leverage like priority standards that I talk about that call for deeper understanding of content, pull those from multiple subject areas. So not only might you be getting the same topic, but that learning is integrated across multiple subject areas. So at the end of the day, you might have an assessment tool like a rubric or something similar that has standards, academic standards from across multiple subject areas that call for deeper understanding of content. And I think when you have that combined with directions, right, that integrate nicely with that assessment tool, that's when you get deeper learning, and that's when you hopefully will get true integration. So looking at things through more of through the lens of the academic standards and what you want your students to know, understand, and be able to do, how they're going to be assessed, and what those activities are going to look like, as opposed to just saying, okay, we're going to just spread this topic out across multiple subject areas. I think that's a more
Right.
powerful, deeply integrated way to go.
It's very surface level.
Mhm.
I hear
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So give us an example of what a good PBL activity would look like, maybe from the lens of like a PE teacher.
Oh wow, that's a good one. So I think like something like students monitoring their own health, right? Like I've
Mhm.
seen that done, like students monitoring their own health. We talked about nutrition before, and using when I was a curriculum supervisor, one of the PE teachers, I wish I could remember the person's name. My memory is like shot, especially because of the pandemic, and I have a bad memory anyway. Is I think it was like one of the apps, like it was like the Under Armour app at the time, like one of those
Right.
apps where you can monitor, your nutrition and your health over the course of a certain period, kind of like keep a journal, um, and then really reflect upon your practice and talk about how you could move forward. So you could think about all you could incorporate that, because if you talk about health and nutrition based on the specific directions you want to take that project, you could incorporate so much. Anything from the health shakes we talked about to like teaching students how to use kettlebells to CrossFit, you know what I mean? Like to running or to yoga or mindfulness or SEL. There's just so much that could be incorporated there. Even like you were drinking out of a water bottle, that we start talking about like, what water bottle should we buy, a hydro flask or should we buy a Yeti, right? Like that might be incorporate that you could incorporate that into some type of nutritional unit. So there's a lot depending on, like I said, how
Yeah.
you craft your directions and what academic standards go into your assessment tool.
And of course, I go right to the math, and I'm thinking, oh, they can make a ratio table about the water consumption and the
Yeah,
calorie
yeah,
burn.
yeah, 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 yeah.
So
So
that's great. So I mean, I think it's important too to think about it through that lens of like, where can we extend, or even I'm a big fan of blooms. I mean, I know it's a little dated, but I love like moving students to the higher level of blooms through that
mhm,
creation phase or applying. And I think
mm.
that's really where that SEL piece can happen. So talk to us about some of those higher level thinking that happens through project-based learning.
Yeah. So I think you could use blooms. I think blooms is fine. And I think in the book we mentioned blooms. We mention Webb's depth of knowledge.
Sure.
The Hess cognitive rigor matrix is there as well. And you could rely on those, but I think it's like how we're using them, right? So just
Mhm.
because people say, oh, that's a level 1 DOK or that's a level 4 DOK, it's not just about the verbs. Um, and it's about the context in which everything is used, right? The verbs and the way they're presented. The context is really important. Um, so I think what really ends up happening is, as a result of students, the way they tackle their challenges or they tackle the product, that natural or their project, that naturally lends itself to higher order thinking. I think the key thing is along the way to build in potential kind of like pit stops, because the last thing you want is the students to get to the end of a 4, 6, or 8 week project and it's like, oh my gosh, you didn't do what you needed to be doing, right? So
Mhm.
it's like, if you know that step number 2 in the project is going to be difficult, step number 3 could say like teacher conference / approval before moving on. That could be like a full-blown conference where you
I
really
see.
sit down with the student for an extended period of time, or it could be just one of those quick check-ins. Looks good, okay, you're ready to move on. And I think that helps, like that serves as a safety net. And to more directly answer your question, as the students are working what we're doing, which is exhausting, but it helps to meet students where they are, is we're constantly conferencing, or you might call it conferring, with students as they are engaged in their projects. So you're looking at what they're doing, you're assessing what they're doing. Based on that, you're kind of deciding what you want to teach into based on
Mhm.
where they are in their project or where they aren't in their project, and then based on the learning targets that you need them to hit, or maybe the skills and tools that they might need, right? As a result of the direction into which they take their project. You teach into that, and then they go off and they apply that knowledge to their project. So that's a way to meet them where they are rather than the other way around. It serves as a safety net, but that constant conferencing or conferring really just helps to the constant feeding of information, which is almost never ending, really helps to promote higher thinking as well as they're applying that new knowledge to the whole that is their project.
Sure. So
Yeah.
you're saying maybe doing some like mini lessons based on what's happening in these conferences, then you're designing, so you're using that as kind of like a formative assessment piece. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's constantly. So those I would say like so you could look at it as like that's conferencing or confer. So if you talk, I keep saying conferencing or conferring because if you're talking about like reading and writing workshop schools out of like Columbia, they call it conferring. So I don't want the literacy gods to get mad at me. So there's that. So there's that, and that's basically meeting with students and the way. Yeah, so it could be like a learning target conference. It could be something that's like a student-led conference where they come to you and they say, I need help with something. And that can be like a skill or tool that they need help with as they're engaging in their project. Or it could be, I call like a reflection conference, which is more like of an assessment. So like if students build something like a solar powered car, I'm just looking for something in the book.
Yeah,
As
that would
students
be
like,
awesome.
yeah. So if students are engineering something like a solar powered car, and you want to know how that car is translating the sun's energy to in order using the sun's energy in order to make their car move, you might not necessarily know that if the student has a deeper understanding of that concept based on looking at the car, right? So you would ask the student certain questions to kind of help to draw out that knowledge and see if the student has it or not. Does that make sense? So that's like a
Mhm.
different type of conference. You could call it a reflection conference, you could call it an assessment conference, but basically you're using it in an assessment type way um,
Right.
to make sure the student has a
To check
deeper
for
understanding of what.
understanding.
Yeah. So those are kind of like how I categorize the three different types of conferences. Um, and like I
So
said, like, go ahead.
if you're a brand new teacher, I mean, this can be so overwhelming. I mean, you're
Yeah,
talking about making solar powered cars and pinball
yeah.
machines, and like, I don't even know if I have the content knowledge for that. So tell me, what is the book going to help me do? I'm a brand new teacher.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have this content specific knowledge to even make this project happen.
Hmm.
And how am I going to be supported?
Yeah. So, so I think it doesn't have to be all or nothing, right? So
Mhm.
if you look at project-based learning, what I like to say is that it's really a bunch of best practices or proven practices strung together. So, um, whether it's publishing, whether it's reflection, whether it's mini lessons, whether it's conferring, um, whether it's self assessment, whether it's peer assessment, flexible learning spaces, all of these practices support full blown project based learning.
Mhm.
So rather than looking at it as like a light switch, you're doing it or you're not. Like you always hear, or not always hear, but sometimes you're like, I'm going to take this unit and we're going to PBL it, right? And then
Right.
it's like you're creating a huge contrast between what your learning space looks like with or without PBL. I look at it as more of a dimmer switch. So if you're overwhelmed, think about one of these practices or a couple of these practices, integrate them deeply, and choose them based on your comfort level and the needs of your students. And then just continue to integrate these practices into your teaching. And in some instances, you might have full blown PBL. In some instances, you might not. And when you do have full blown PBL, of course, like we could always do better. But it's really about like creating like a culture of inquiry and agency.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes it's going to be full blown PBL, and sometimes it just won't be. Do I think it should be sometimes? Sure, because that's how I believe students learn best. But I think if anything, I always say the only thing I'm selling, like if you're listening to this and you're like, this guy's full of garbage, which you might, which is fine. The only thing I'm really selling, to be honest, is student ownership and this
Right.
idea that the classroom should be more about the students than us. And if you don't believe that, um, maybe you need to think your, in a nice way, maybe you need to rethink your career path, because our school should be more about our students than about us. And I think there are a lot of organizations, to be blunt, that almost like probably unintentionally or subconsciously like cater more towards the comfort level of the students. I'm sorry, the comfort level of the adults more so than the needs of the students. So
Right.
like if you're saying or thinking to yourself that full-blown PBL is too much, just think about how you might transfer ownership of your space to the students a little bit more, like over and over and over again. Yeah, and I think you'll be surprised as to what you could accomplish. Sometimes you hear, the kids I have couldn't do this. They have IPs. They're in kindergarten.
Right.
I I've seen it done at all ages, all
Well, I
grade
think
levels, and
you
yeah,
said it, and when you were talking earlier, you said about the teacher's beliefs, the teacher's expectation of their students is kind of like a manifest reality, right? It's like your
yeah,
expectations of what they're capable of becomes the reality. And there's definitely research showing that like the best predictor of students' outcomes is the teacher's belief in them.
hmm,
So if
yeah,
you're kind of setting that bar really low, saying like, "Oh, my kids are not going to be capable of doing this," then guess what? You're right because you've set that bar at that level.
yeah,
Versus like, thinking outside the box and really like opening up your learning space to let the students lead the learning. Let them be the teachers. Let them show what
yeah,
they know. Because I'm always a big fan of like, I always tell my student teachers, whoever does the most talking does the most learning. So if I'm
mhm,
watching you teach a lesson as, your professor and you're teaching 90% of the time, you're the only one that's learning that concept. Like,
yeah,
hello.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's yeah, I mean, like all the research aside, there's a great quote that says, like, I think it's like from an anonymous 6-year-old, my teacher thought I was smarter than I was, so I was, right? I mean, that's really what it is. And I always say, or I question when we say the students we have couldn't do this, because we've all heard that, oh, the students I have couldn't do this. When we say the students I have couldn't do this, are we talking about our students' limitations, or are we talking about our own, right? And a lot of
Mm,
times it's our own, right? Like no, you can't do it, or you're not comfortable with that. So
right.
your students are going to be limited by your comfort zone, and that's fine, right? Because we've all been there and done that. But I think we need to move past that.
And I would agree that especially in the age of like post-pandemic, where kids have been sitting idly at a computer screen and watching this very transmission approach to teaching, we need to kind of open that door to PBL and invite kids into learning. And if you've taught math for as long as I did, you might have kids say, well, why do I need to learn to do this when I can just get my phone and ask Siri what the answer is? So PBL does not allow that to happen. You can't just Google it. You have to
Yeah,
create
yeah,
it. You have to
yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think a lot of times students, they're moving 100 miles of hour outside of school, and then they come into school and they slow down, right? And
Mhm.
because it's like um, it's inauthentic, right? It's really inauthentic, and it a lot of experiences are inauthentic, and it doesn't necessarily. Um, we're trying to take something that's inauthentic and like make it work for learning, but it doesn't. And a lot of times it just doesn't work, and a lot of times we're dumbing things down, um, and our students in some instances have surpassed us, right? Especially, well, I shouldn't say especially, but in a lot of instances, yes. Like that's really what's happened. Put your phone away, put your MacBook away, and now we're going to learn, and that's not authentic. And then it's like this idea. There's a great quote by Austin Kleon, who's a writer out of hipster Austin, Texas, and he says, "School is one thing, education is another. The two don't necessarily always overlap." And I
Mhm.
love that. So it's like this idea of students playing the game of school, then they go home and the real learning takes place. So how do we
Right.
make sure that learning takes place with us, in our space? And you hear so many stories about students doing wonderful things, and it's like, oh, and by the way, that was done 4 p.m. to 10 p.m. after they got home from school, right? So how do we make sure that it takes place not in spite of us, but because of us?
So we've spent some time, Ross, talking and unpacking PBL. Tell our listeners, what are they going to find in the book, and how is it going to inspire them
Yeah.
to become practitioners of project-based learning?
Yeah. So the book's website, check it out, realpbl.com. Plenty of free stuff on there, plus a link to the book on Amazon. Plenty of free stuff on there that I promise it, we spent a lot of time on that. We made it in conjunction with the book, so there's tight integration between the two. So it's like this whole project-based learning system that's there to support you. So that's all free. The book, each chapter, I think I might have said this, is basically a common question that practitioners have about PBL. So I'll just rattle them off. Why project-based learning? How do I structure a PBL experience? How do I get grades? How do I confront with students? How do I include direct instruction? How do I build a PBL culture? How do I manage the chaos? How does inquiry relate to PBL? How do I get started with PBL? And all those questions, each chapter is our response to each one of them.
Awesome.
And all of the answers strung together detail project-based learning in its entirety. So you get the forest from the trees, so to speak. It's not like you're just going to get the response to each question. Then it's like, but how do I do this? It details that as well. And shout out, the foreword of the book was written by a good friend of mine, who's the head of innovation for Future Ready, Tom Murray.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
so he wrote the foreword. He was nice enough to do that, and that's a great part of the book as well. So we're very proud of it. I think a lot of times we like see videos about PBL, read books about PBL and articles about PBL, and then we're like, that's great, but how? Like, how do I?
Right.
And we wanted this book to really end that conversation. Like when you read this, although it's not easy, right? Nothing's ever easy, especially when you're trying something new. But when you read this, like this book, especially when combined with the website, for what, like $20, right? It's 2.5 years of book. 2.5 years of work, of endless work that you get for $20. Um, I honestly think it kind of nips it in the bud. It nips it in the bud, and it doesn't answer everything because no one book can. But I think after reading this, you'll be confident implementing PBL. And if you're already confident, I think there's value added there too.
Awesome. I love it. Well, I think it's great for teachers to kind of go into that tipping point of embracing, as I would say, you talked about chaos. I say, embrace the chaos,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
sometimes it's in those moments of chaos where the learning is actually happening. It's much
Hmm.
better than when you walk into a classroom and it's just one person talking, it's just one person's thought. But letting kids create and letting them discover, and as you shared, that whole mindset of inquiry can be really stormy. So that's okay.
Hmm.
Um, but I want to thank you for coming on the show, Ross, and talking about PBL and the importance of PBL and how to embrace an inquiry approach into your instruction, as well as talking about the value of culture and how to frame culture in the classroom. Because I think,
Hmm.
unlike a traditional textbook, we all, we're in our classrooms, we're given our curriculum. It may or may not always work. Finding the unit rate for a rug is not very meaningful to me if I've never made a rug. So why would I
Hmm.
even want to find the unit rate of a rug in a problem? It's just
Yep,
like,
yep.
really? Okay. How can I bring this into the level of like the lives of my students? Because yeah, that's really what it's all about. So thank you for coming on. And we got your site. It's called realpbl.com, and your book is on Amazon. Tell us the title one more time.
Project-based learning, real questions, real answers. How to unpack PBL and inquiry.
Love it.
Co-authored with Aaron Murphy.
All right, Ross. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening. And I hope to have you back on the show soon.
That was awesome. Thanks, Dr. D.
You're welcome anytime.